we need to have a word about War of the Worlds 1934. So just in case you are actually from Mars and you've not heard of the War of the Worlds, well, it's about... The story is set against the backdrop of a Martian invasion of the United Kingdom, and it is an existential horror. If you was a Victorian reading this would have been absolutely horrifying for you, because you, at that point, spent a century at the top of the global pecking order. There was no military force in the world that could have threatened Britain at the time. Well, so you thought. So that's it, that's the story at face value. But when you just scratch beneath the surface a little bit, there's so much more going on. And that is the key to explaining the story's longevity and why it adapts so seamlessly into other genres and other mediums. The story follows an unnamed protagonist as he makes his way across the home counties, set against the backdrop of this Martian invasion. All of our terrestrial weapons are absolutely useless against this oncoming threat, and the Martians are absolutely without mercy. They conduct a campaign of chemical warfare, they indiscriminately target civilians, they wreck the entire infrastructure of southern England. Nothing can stop this invasion, with the exception of one tactical victory, I would say, by the Royal Navy. And Wells doesn't spare the reader neither. He goes into graphic detail about the horrors of warfare and the breakdown of society and civilization that happens. And when the horror is complete, when you're at the point of reading the novel and you sort of feel there is no hope for humanity at this point, because the greatest military force on the planet has been set aside within a matter of weeks by this invasion. Just when you give up hope, the Martians succumb to a bacterial or virological infection which wipes out their invasion force. So this video actually started out life as a sort of like, I'm going to do the War of the Worlds. I haven't covered it yet, but I want to cover it. But during my research for a previous video, I stumbled across what I think is probably one of the most criminally undersubscribed channels on YouTube, and that is War of the Worlds 1934. What these guys have done at War of the Worlds 1934 is they've taken this 130 odd year old story, they've used the latest medium that we have available to us, which is YouTube, it's internet, it's streaming, and all of the technology that comes with that, computer animation and whatnot. And they've slotted that just perfectly into that mid-1930s setting. So as I said a moment ago, there's a lot going on beneath the surface. When you scratch it away, it's more than just an alien invasion story. So let's put War of the Worlds in context. So the first among these sort of interpretations of the story are that it's an allegory for the British Empire at the time, specifically the British Empire's actions in Tasmania, where the native population were massacred by an alien force of such technological progress and power that it must have seemed like these were creatures from another planet attacking them. And that's a very valid interpretation of it. I adhere to that interpretation myself. That is definitely what Wells was writing about. I think he even said it himself as well. Beyond that, let's have a look at the context of it. When was it written? Well, it was written in 1895. It was serialised until 1897. It was first published in hardback in 1898. We can thank Mrs. Sci-Fi for that bit of research there. But the War of the Worlds can fall into a broader literary genre than just pure science fiction. Well, they were scientific romances, as they was known at the time. But broadly speaking, the War of the Worlds falls into what we call invasion literature. And invasion literature, at its heart, deals with the British Empire and the British Isles themselves coming under attack from a superior military force. But not always. I mean, as mentioned before in my previous video, Dracula can be seen as part of the invasion literature sort of wave. but it was a huge genre at the time. It was big business. These books sold and they reached into the sort of cultural zeitgeist. One of the novels in this genre was called The Battle of Dorking, and it was sort of not uncommon for people with an injury or people with a limp or something like that, when questioned about how they got their injury, they would say, jokingly, I got it at the Battle of Dorking. There's another book called The World Power of 1910. It actually outsold The War of the Worlds. It was more popular with the public at the time. And I've got to be honest with you, when I read it, I actually quite enjoyed it. This genre started gaining real traction after the Franco-Prussian War. It was the first sort of modern-ish war that people could read about in their newspapers. And the whole point, the whole purpose of this subgenre was to shake the Victorian public out of their malaise, out of their complacency that they were the number one people on this planet. Because jeopardy was close. World War I was on the horizon. People sensed it. Every time Germany launched a new battleship, it made headlines in the United Kingdom. The Victorian public needed to be shaken awake, and that's what these novels were about. That's what they did. Wells, on the other hand, used that subgenre to create a masterpiece and give us the blueprint for any other invasion story. And if you don't believe me, watch what happens at the end of Independence Day. What defeats the aliens? Well, it's a bug, innit? It's a computer bug. But Jeff Goldblum himself even says we're going to give them a cold. What defeats the Martians? This is why the 1938 broadcast by Orson Welles was so popular at the time. People sensed that the Second World War was on the horizon. The American public needed to be shaken out of that malaise. They needed to know that war was coming. And Welles did a fantastic job of that. And people often talk about that one and they say that it was influential in that it was the first time we saw mass panic induced by media. And yeah, there was a little bit of panic, but I feel from my research that it's a bit overhyped, the amount of panic there was. Its next big adaptation in 1953, the famous George Powell version of it, absolutely brilliant. It's one of my most favourite films of all time. Well, that's entirely about the dangers of the Cold War. That's about the slow, insidious creep of global communism. That's about a Russian invasion. That's, as much as it is about a Martian invasion, it's about a conventional World War III happening. And again, the Western public, specifically the American public, needed to be shaken awake, awoken to the dangers of atomic warfare. And then we've got the 1978 musical version of it. Now, at this point in history, mankind is on the cusp of something. It is, we turn left or we turn right, because the Cold War was hotting right up at this point. Throughout the 1980s, the Cold War got cold. And again, this story, this invasion story, is used to subconsciously spread that message. And then we come to the 2005 version, that post 9/11, post Iraq version of the story. And to me, this is a bit of an outlier, because to me, this is less about waking the public up to a danger and more about waking the public up to American foreign policy at the time, about the war in Iraq, about the excesses of the war on terrorism. In that sense, it's probably the most anti-imperialist and least jingoistic version of the story, and probably, on a philosophical level, the closest one so far to H.G. Wells' vision for the story. And then we reach the 2019 version, the BBC version from 2019. Well, everything the BBC made in 2019, of course, was about Brexit. Or was it? And that brings me to it. That brings me to The War of the Worlds 1934. Why is it so good? Against all of that, all those Hollywood productions of it, why is this version so good? Well, the story's good to start with. Other than that, it's very simple. This story fits whatever medium you put it into really well, but some more than others. The analog horror genre to start with. So, for those who don't know, analog horror is a subgenre of horror, and it normally sort of follows a sort of pattern of found footage, for instance, grainy kind of videotape that's been dug up from somewhere. The Blair Witch Project, that's an analogue horror. But in the modern context, in the internet age context, analogue horror is almost an alternate reality that you can follow in real time. There's Twitter stories, for instance. People go on Twitter/X and they are tweeting as if they're in this alternate world where an alien invasion is taking place, for instance. And War of the Worlds 1934 does it brilliantly. It hits the nail right on the head with it. It is perfectly animated. What Chris has done, he has created something absolutely beautiful to look at. I actually think far more than any other adaptation of War of the Worlds, he captures something about those tripods, something really alien about them. He's definitely taken aspects from Spielberg and other adaptations of it, for certain, yes, but he's made it his own. He's done something genuinely really original with this. And it's not just the tripods, it's the harvesters, the crab-like machines that travel with the tripods in their invasion. They've got this really spooky, creepy, otherworldly feel to them and movement about them, which is very, very intuitive, but at the same time feels very off somehow. Exactly the way an alien would move. Also, what he's done with these tripods is he's given them unique personalities as well. I mean, there's a scene where they get bombed and one of them seemingly has his eye put out. See what I'm doing? I'm calling it he, I'm referring to it, I'm gendering it because I just feel that that's its character. And it's really it looks angry, it looks spiteful, this machine. It's absolutely brilliant. He's taken that whole found footage aesthetic as well, and he's just turned it inside out and upside down. And rather than it being a grainy videotape we've got this newsreel footage, this authentic newsreel footage from 1934. And for something that's set in 1934, which is almost a century away at this point, you're really drawn into it. It is very gritty and realistic. You feel like you're there. You feel like you're in 1934 with it. You sort of invest in it. You invest in the sort of characterizations of these tripods. You invest in these sort of random characters you'll see, because the camera will just pan across a room and you'll see some photographs and you'll know, oh, hang on a minute, that's the pilot of that bomber, and you'll hear his voice. There's some genuinely really good voice acting going on as well. It really adds to it, really sucks you in. There is a plot structure to what he's doing as well. It follows a character, but it's subtle. And yeah, I'm going to admit it, there's some genuinely scary parts of it as well. If you're watching it late at night on your own, it can be quite creepy. I also think it speaks to something very, very British in how we deal with crises. We have a penchant for reaching back into our history for inspiration in times of crisis. Before World War II and World War I, we would sort of reach back to the exploits of Francis Drake, for instance. And obviously World War II, post-World War II, we reach back to that conflict for our inspiration. We saw that during the COVID pandemic, with people singing Vera Lynn songs, for instance, and trying to sort of evoke that Blitz spirit. But again, War of the Worlds 1934 sort of takes you at a different angle, and that's what's unsettling about it, because it takes place between World War I and World War II. So visually, yes, it's very recognisably World War II, but it's not. And that's quite jarring for the modern viewer. But what amazes me as well is that although these videos of his sort of go between 3 and 5 minutes in length at times, up to about 10 minutes at times, he doesn't lose any of the other kind of subtext to the story. And it's that subtext which makes every adaptation of War of the Worlds great. Those themes of religion and science and social Darwinism and colonialism. And somehow, War of the Worlds 1934 manages to get all that perfectly, but also capture the zeitgeist of 2024. Now, I said before, it's invasion literature. Well, we all know where we are in the world of 2024. We've all seen the news of the past few days kind of thing. The head of NATO making these sort of broad statements about looming conflict in Eastern Europe. I think subconsciously we all knew that. But War of the Worlds 1934 gets that. But it puts this really unique spin to it. And when I spoke to Chris about this, I asked him, I've been in touch with a guy, he's an absolute gentleman, answered all my questions, this sort of low-level YouTuber, asking him silly questions for over an hour on a Friday. He has much better things to do than talk to me, but he took the time out and I'm grateful for that. I asked him about the origin of this, why he started this, and the story he told me was absolutely brilliant. It started out during the events of 2020 to 2022, when nobody was allowed to really see each other or go out or do anything. And his sister was part of an amateur dramatic society in their local area. And they thought, well, what can they do with a minimal cast of people? And what they came up with was doing a radio version of it in the style of 1938. And she reached out to her brother, who's, in my opinion, an absolute genius at computer animation, to come up with some visuals for the story. And that's how this got started. Visuals for his sister's performance of it. An invasion story that was necessitated by an invasion of a virus. That's brilliant. Necessity, it seems, is the mother of invention. But from that, from those restrictions he had in place on him, he's created this, and it's absolutely brilliant. And it has to be said as well, it was a virus that saved humanity at the end of the book, when H.G. Wells finally chickened out and let God do some work for him in the book. But it's more than that. Now, the first and most earliest example of analogue horror, well, it's the War of the Worlds from 1938. It's that Orson Welles broadcast. It also does its science fiction storytelling very differently as well, in a contemporary sense. Now, the state of modern British science fiction is just all over the place. At one end of the spectrum, we're getting these sort of overly cynical pastiches and satires on modern society from the likes of Black Mirror and Utopia. And at the other end, we're getting the childlike bonkersness of modern Doctor Who. And again, if it's not that, it's Red Dwarf. Or it's a version of the War of the Worlds that is set in a Victorian setting, but it's about contemporary politics. It's about modern conflicts. It's about modern social struggles. It's about Brexit. But again, that's something War of the Worlds 1934 does brilliantly. Again, that word brilliant, I keep saying it, but honestly, it's how I feel about it. It's a brilliant series, and it brilliantly straddles that line. It is straight in the middle of all of that. It is at no end of any spectrum. Now, I've been showing you a lot of video from Chris's channel here, and I'm going to credit him in the video description, but I'm also going to put a link to his channel because I want you to go over there and I want you to subscribe to it, because I think it is just absolutely criminal how undersubscribed it is. And if you do go over there, you've got the added bonus as well that you'll be going in on the ground floor, because he's not finished yet. They haven't finished making this series yet. You'll be one of the first subscribers out of what I hope is going to be millions for him, because he deserves it. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. And I really do enjoy interacting with you guys in the comments as well, hearing your thoughts and opinions on what I'm saying, because ultimately the philosophy of this channel is that, hey, it's a personal view.